This man killed a young woman and confessed that slitting the victim's throat gave him the greatest thrill of his life. After 39 years on death row, he has finally been scheduled for execution on September 5, 2025. Today, we will explore the story from when Ralph Menzies became a killer to his final days in prison, and whether justice will be served after nearly 4 decades of waiting. Due to the serious nature of this case, viewers should exercise caution when following along. On February 23, 1986, at a gas station in Kearns, Utah, Maureen Hunsaker disappeared during her evening shift. This cream-colored Chevrolet will become crucial evidence later. Remember the name Walter Britton. His testimony will change everything. Ralph Menzies, 27 years old, was a criminal with a history of violence who had just been released on bail only 3 days earlier. He kidnapped Maureen from her workplace, held her overnight at Big Cottonwood Canyon, then strangled and slashed her throat. The most terrifying aspect is that Menzies confessed to a cellmate that killing Maureen had given him the greatest thrill of his life. Comment what you think. Should Menzies be executed after 39 years of waiting? Maureen Forschen Hunsaker was born on February 28, 1959, a 26-year-old young woman, building a life with her husband Jim. She worked evening shifts at a gas station in Kearns to earn extra income. Maureen was a devoted wife who always called home after her work shifts. Meanwhile, Ralph Leroy Menzies was born on April 21, 1958, and grew up in a family filled with violence and neglect. He was brutally abused by his stepfathers, beaten, deprived of food, forced to sleep in a tiny room with his sister for 3 years, and even prevented from attending school. After his biological mother died early, Menzies grew up without proper care. The fateful intersection occurred on February 23, 1986, when Menzies, having just been released on bail 3 days earlier, decided to commit a robbery at the gas station where Maureen worked. But there was one detail that even police didn't expect. Menzies had brought along a hunting knife and intended to kill from the very beginning. Ralph Menzies began his criminal path very early. In 1976, when he was just 18 years old, he was convicted of aggravated robbery and sentenced to 5 years to life. According to criminal psychology experts, Menzies beginning crime at such a young age shows that deep psychological trauma from childhood had severely affected his behavior. In 1978, Menzies and another inmate named Johnny Ray Sloan successfully escaped from prison. A week later, on July 17, 1978, Menzies robbed and shot a taxi driver with a shotgun. The trial for this case ended in a deadlock when the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. In 1979, Menzies received another sentence of 5 years to life for aggravated robbery, along with a concurrent sentence of 1 to 15 years for escaping prison. There are 5 warning signs everyone should know about Menzies' violence from a young age: escalating severity of crimes, tendency to flee use of weapons in crimes, and lack of remorse after each arrest. On October 9, 1984, Menzies was paroled and released. Just 1 year later, in December 1985, he was arrested again for stealing Christmas decorations. On February 10, 1986, Menzies pleaded guilty to attempted theft and was scheduled for sentencing on March 11th. He was released on bail on February 20th, 1986. Just 3 days later, on February 23rd, Menzies would commit his most brutal crime. On the evening of February 23rd, 1986, Maureen Hunsaker was working her evening shift at the gas station in Kearns when Ralph Menzies appeared. According to Menzies' own testimony, he claimed to have picked up Maureen from the gas station, but in reality, he had kidnapped her along with $106 from the cash register. Maureen was forced into the cream-colored 1974 Chevrolet that Menzies had borrowed from his friend Troy Denter. From Menzies' perspective, he later testified that he picked up his girlfriend Nicole Arnold and drove around with both women until they began fighting. He said he dropped off Arnold first, then dropped off the other woman somewhere near 7200 West and 2400 South. From the witnesses' perspective, two high school students, Tim Larrabee and Beth Brown, saw two people at Storm Mountain on the morning of February 24th. One person matched Maureen's description, the other was a white male with black curly hair and beard about 25 to 36 years old, weighing approximately 170 pounds and 6'1", tall, matching Menzies. From the family's perspective, Maureen's husband Jim called his wife that evening, but no one answered. When Jim arrived at the gas station, he discovered his wife and her purse, along with money from the register, had disappeared. Around 11:05 p.m., Jim received a call from Maureen, who sounded frightened and confused. Maureen told her husband she had been kidnapped by someone who wanted to rob her and that she would be released soon. However, the call was cut off abruptly before Jim and police could ask further questions. Pause the video and comment what you would do if you were Jim in this situation. On February 25, 1986, a hiker discovered Maureen's body near the Storm Mountain picnic area in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Her throat was slashed and her wrists showed marks indicating she had been tied up. The bark of a nearby tree was scuffed, suggesting she had been tied to the tree before her death. The autopsy report showed Maureen died from ligature strangulation, and the slash wound caused by a knife also contributed to her death. The investigation linked Ralph Menzies to the murder through multiple pieces of evidence. Menzies was jailed on unrelated burglary charges on February 24th, one day before the body was found. A jailer discovered 4 of Maureen's identification cards in a laundry hamper in the changing room Menzies used. Tim Larrabee and Beth Brown confirmed seeing a car matching the Chevrolet that Menzies borrowed from Troy Denter. When police searched Menzies' apartment, they found Maureen's purse and some of the money missing from the gas station register. A hunting knife was found and determined capable of inflicting the throat wounds on Maureen. DNA testing later confirmed that Denter's car contained Maureen's fingerprints, but investigators didn't know that the most important evidence would come from Menzies' own confession to a cellmate. With the evidence gathered, Menzies was arrested and charged with murdering Maureen Hunsaker. After Menzies was charged, additional evidence linking him to the murder emerged. Menzies' cellmate, Walter Britton, contacted police and reported that Menzies had confessed to killing Maureen during a conversation with him. Menzies allegedly claimed that slitting Maureen's throat had given him the greatest thrill of his life. Additionally, the father of Menzies' girlfriend also discovered Maureen's Social Security card among his daughter's possessions. In 1986, investigative technology was limited, with no security cameras, no modern DNA testing, relying mainly on fingerprints and witness testimony. Physical evidence included the victim's identification cards, purse, stolen money hunting knife, and fingerprints in the car. Important testimony came from witnesses who saw Menzies and Maureen together, and especially the confession to cellmate Walter Britton. Ralph Menzies was finally brought to trial before a jury on February 18, 1988. Menzies faced 1 count of aggravated murder and 1 count of kidnapping. Salt Lake County prosecutors sought the death penalty under Utah state law for the aggravated murder charge. Jury selection began on February 4, 1988. During the trial, the prosecution argued that Menzies had kidnapped and murdered Maureen Hunsaker from her workplace in the suburban town of Kearns, Utah, held her hostage at Big Cottonwood Canyon overnight before strangling and slashing her throat, seeking a first-degree murder conviction. The defense argued that Menzies should be convicted of second-degree murder, a lesser charge not carrying the death penalty, after they made arguments disputing the elements of the charge where the existence of robbery or kidnapping during the course of murder was required to make it a capital crime. The prosecution relied on overwhelming physical evidence and witness testimony, while the defense focused on mitigating the charges based on Menzies' difficult background and psychological issues. On March 8, 1988, after a month-long trial, the jury found Menzies guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. Before sentencing, Menzies waived his right to jury sentencing and allowed a judge to decide his punishment instead. The defense argued that Menzies should be spared the death penalty and receive a life sentence instead because he suffered from mental disorders and had an abusive childhood and should receive judicial mercy on humanitarian grounds. However, the prosecution sought the death penalty for Menzies, stating it was appropriate because he had a long criminal history and showed little to no rehabilitative effect during his previous prison terms, continuing to commit robbery even after being harshly dealt with by the law, culminating in Maureen's cold-blooded murder. On March 23, 1988, Judge Raymond Uno sentenced Menzies to death for Maureen's murder, and at the sentencing hearing, Menzies chose death by firing squad as his execution method. His execution date was scheduled for May 20, 1988, but it was stayed pending mandatory review by the Utah Supreme Court. After being sentenced in 1988, Ralph Menzies remained on death row for more than 3 decades, filing multiple appeals against his death sentence during these years. On March 11, 1992, the Utah Supreme Court rejected Menzies' appeal for a retrial. On March 29, 1994, the Utah Supreme Court dismissed Menzies' appeal and upheld his conviction and sentence. A year later, Menzies received his death warrant scheduling execution by firing squad for June 2, 1995, but on May 4, 1995, Menzies obtained a stay of execution due to pending appeals. According to Maureen Hunsaker's parents, they were disappointed that Menzies would not be executed at that time for their daughter's death. Many other appeals by Menzies were rejected in 1996, 2003, 2004, 2012, 2014, 2019, 2022. And finally, in October 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear Menzies' appeal, exhausting all of Menzies' standard appeals. On January 17, 2024, Utah state attorneys announced they were seeking an execution date for Ralph Menzies, who had chosen to die by firing squad. Since Menzies was sentenced to death before May 2004, he was allowed to choose between lethal injection and firing squad. This was the 3rd time the state sought to execute Menzies, who had by then exhausted all avenues of appeal against his death sentence. In response, Menzies' defense counsel argued he should not be executed because he was mentally incompetent to undergo the death penalty. Menzies was reportedly suffering from dementia and did not fully understand why he should be put to death for his crime. An official hearing to approve Menzies' death warrant was originally scheduled to begin on February 23, 2024, but 10 days before the hearing, a judge canceled it and directed the state to seek an independent report on Menzies' mental competency for execution. On August 7, 2024, Menzies was scheduled to undergo a competency hearing on August 12, 2024, and also underwent psychiatric evaluation to determine whether he was mentally competent to be executed. Menzies' competency hearing took place on November 18, 2024, and was expected to last about a week. 3rd District Court Judge Matthew Bates presided over the hearing. State medical experts, neurologist Ryan Green and forensic psychologist Michael Brooks of the Utah Department of Health and Human Services submitted that Ralph Menzies was competent to be executed, but his lawyers disagreed and said he should not be executed. The 5-day hearing concluded on November 22, 2024. On June 6, 2025, Judge Bates officially ruled that Menzies was mentally competent to be executed. The judge cited in his ruling that despite recent signs of deterioration in his cognitive abilities due to dementia, Menzies consistently and rationally understands the magnitude of his actions, and there was no evidence showing that based on Menzies' current condition, his execution would violate the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. According to Matt Hunsaker, Maureen Hunsaker's son, he appreciated the court's diligence in making a swift ruling on the case, and his family hoped to see Menzies executed soon for killing his mother. On June 9, 2025, Utah prosecutors filed a renewed motion to issue a death warrant. Judge Bates set a July 9th hearing to consider the motion. At the same time, defense counsel filed an appeal to the Utah Supreme Court against Judge Bates's ruling. The defense also sought another competency hearing, claiming that during the year while Menzies' first competency hearing was conducted, his mental state had rapidly deteriorated, making him ineligible for execution. On July 9, 2025, Judge Matthew Bates signed a death warrant for Menzies, scheduling his execution date for September 5, 2025. On September 5, 2025, 24 hours before his execution, Ralph Menzies will experience his final hours of life. According to Utah protocol, Menzies will be allowed to meet with family, friends, and lawyers one last time. He will have the opportunity to make final phone calls and write letters. Menzies' mood will be monitored by guards and chaplains to ensure he is in stable condition before execution. Preparation procedures, including meetings with the warden and final procedures, will be conducted. Psychologically, it's unclear whether Menzies will be calm, panicked, or resigned in his final hours. Menzies' last meal will be served around 6 a.m. on September 5th. Although not yet revealed, last meals typically reflect deep personal memories or preferences of the inmate. Psychology experts suggest that choosing a last meal can reveal the inmate's psychological state, possibly nostalgia for the past, desire for comfort, or even denial of reality. Compared to other famous last meals, what will Menzies' meal say about the psychology of a man who has awaited death for 39 years? Ralph Menzies' final words will be recorded in the execution chamber at Utah State Prison. Witnesses, including victim family representatives, media lawyers, and prison officials, will be present. Menzies' final words may reveal remorse, denial, or even a final challenge. The impact of these words on Maureen Hunsaker's family, especially her son Matt, will be significant after 39 years of waiting for justice. Comment what you think about someone having to wait nearly 4 decades for execution. The firing squad execution process will be conducted solemnly and according to proper protocol. Menzies will be strapped to a chair blindfolded, and 5 marksmen will carry out the task with 4 live rounds and 1 blank. Time of death will be recorded precisely by the medical examiner. Immediate reactions from Maureen's family, media, and the public will mark the end of one of the longest-running cases in Utah death row history. With Ralph Menzies' death, this chapter will finally close after nearly 4 decades of waiting. Matt Hunsaker. Maureen's son has become a grown man throughout this prolonged legal process. He was only 10 years old when his mother was killed and has now spent nearly his entire life waiting for justice. The Hunsaker family has endured decades of retrials, appeals, and delays. Matt's grandmother, Maureen's mother, died in 2021 without seeing her daughter's killer executed. Matt has inherited her wish and continues fighting to keep his mother's memory alive even after 39 years since Maureen was murdered. Ralph Menzies is currently Utah's longest-serving death row inmate after Douglas Stewart Carter's sentence was overturned in May 2025. The Ralph Menzies case has led to changes in Utah's justice system, particularly regarding procedures for evaluating the mental competency of death row inmates. Menzies' dementia in old age has raised questions about the ethics of executing those who may no longer fully understand their actions and consequences. The complex appeals system has also been reconsidered to avoid such prolonged delays. Unanswered questions remain about whether the justice system can balance ensuring fair legal process with providing timely closure for victims' families. Is 39 years of waiting too long to carry out justice, or is it the necessary time to ensure no errors in the death penalty system? The Ralph Menzies case serves as a reminder of the importance of early intervention for abused children and psychological support systems. While Menzies' difficult childhood cannot justify his brutal actions, it shows the importance of breaking cycles of violence and abuse. It also emphasizes the need for effective rehabilitation programs in the prison system to prevent recidivism. If you know of any cases showing signs of child abuse or domestic violence, please contact local authorities for support. Today, nearly 40 years after the massacre, Ralph Menzies will finally face the consequences of his actions. The question remains whether this delay has diminished the meaning of justice, or whether the long time allowed the system to ensure the final decision was correct. For Maureen Hunsaker's family, especially her son, Matt, September 5, 2025 will mark the end of a prolonged legal journey and may bring the peace they have sought for nearly 4 decades.